Hi, Peter. Thanks for
Morning.
coming today to talk to us at O'Reilly. So, your company is doing something interesting in the JavaScript place and bringing it to the Internet of Things, and you've recently open sourced the library. And I wonder why you did that, how it's good for your company and good for the people who will use the library.
Sure. So the library that we've open sourced is the Kinoma JS app framework, and that is really unusual in that it's a completely JavaScript-based tool for building Internet of Things devices. And that JavaScript engine that's in there is our own. It's not V8 or SpiderMonkey or any of the usual JavaScript engines. And we built it specifically for embedded devices, and so it's much smaller. In fact, here at the show, we are demonstrating the latest version of it that runs in as little as 512 kilobytes of RAM. So it
sounds like 1980s style memory use.
Exactly. The second generation Mac was the 512K Fat Mac, and that's what we're talking about here. And so for putting something into a power outlet or putting something to a light, you need something that's that small. And so now you can script those. And so we've been working on this engine for about a decade. And we open sourced it this spring so that all kinds of people could use it. And we really recognize that although the technology is useful to us and our customers, that ultimately it has to be open to make sense. Our customers expect to get the source code to it. They expect to be able to have that so that they can move it forward at their own pace, so that they can understand the security implications of that code, and so that they're not always going to be dependent on us. We also know that with Internet of Things, you're building an ecosystem of products. You're not building just one product that stands by itself. And my team is part of Marvell Semiconductor, so we expect and we hope that a lot of those devices will have Marvell chips in them, but we know that that all of them won't. And that's okay, but our customers want to use our software in all kinds of different chips so that they can make the right choice for each product and each generation of product. And so it's very interesting. We got into the conversation about open source coming really out of our crowdfunding campaign. Which we did a piece of hardware called Kinoma Create, where our crowdfunders said to us, of course it's going to be open source. There's no choice. And we said, yeah, but our parent company, it's a semiconductor company. They don't really do open source as like a matter of business.
Even though Intel is supposedly big in open source.
Yeah. And Marvell actually, back when when Linux was coming to ARM, they invested a lot there, in fact. And so they have moments of openness, but it's not baked into the corporate DNA yet. And so we kind of went back and reopened the conversation about open source around our crowdfunding campaign, and we were making progress. But what ultimately kind of got this out the door was the fact that we had mainstream customers, big brands that you find in Best Buy, saying, we love your technology and we will adopt it if it's open source, and if it's not, we're going to find something else. And that gets the attention of the sales teams and of the executive management, and said, okay, if we're going to push forward and we're going to get the most out of our investment in this technology, we're going to have to make it open for everybody. And so they've really embraced it. My boss, who's one of the founders of the company and is the president of the company, when we did the press release for this show talking about our new JavaScript engine, called me up the day before the release was finalized and said, oh, it's great. There's only one thing. There's not enough open source in here. I said, that's great. I'm happy to fix that for you.
Yeah, so you've been in that community and you were very comfortable with it all along.
Yeah, I mean, I first got involved in open source when I was at Apple in the 90s, which goes back a few years, when we did the QuickTime streaming server, which was an open source streaming server for the RTSP and RTP standard. And that was a really controversial decision at Apple at the time. And so I did open source then, had kind of been away from it for a while, but have come back through the work on Kinoma JS at Marvell.
I noticed there were three arguments you went through them rather quickly, but there were sort of three arguments for why the Internet of Things should have open source software. One is you mentioned security, because there are flaws in all software, proprietary as well as open. Another one you mentioned is, what if you go away? What if you're not interested and the customers want to keep using the software? And those are both arguments that the open source community has been making for years, but the third argument is made less often, and that is that you would really like to have a third-party ecosystem for devices. And unfortunately, it seems that most device manufacturers are keeping things very closed so far.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, the first 2 points are kind of historically like some of the big arguments in favor of open source. But you know, what's happening if you look at devices in our world, computers were basically completely open, and still largely the case, right? You can bring up Linux on almost any laptop that you can buy today, for example. Phones are kind of open. You know, Google and Apple give us permission to do a lot. Not everything, but some. But when you get into the Internet of Things devices, they're just black boxes. That's it. And what we've seen is some companies, because of the obligations of the GPL, for example, will give you a Linux distribution you can put on there. But of course, that's something that very few ordinary people are able to do, right? And so how open are those devices if only, you know, a handful of people have the ability to change them? And so I think what's fascinating about scripting languages is that they give us a way to be more open in a device. Because, you know, how did JavaScript start? It started as the plug-in language for the web, right? So that I could have a little bit of logic inside of this giant web browser, but that gave me a lot of control, right, over that experience. And it came with security concerns, right? Why don't we let scripts in a web page do everything? Because we don't want web pages digging into our home network, right? IoT, they make the same arguments. We can't make this open to third-party code because it has to be secure. Well, there's a continuum of secure, and the user should be able to decide. But instead of having the user completely reflash the ROM and change everything, which I understand could be a little bit tricky and create security concerns, can we open those devices to scripts? And the scripts, just like in the browser, will have access to a lot of things, but not everything, right? And as a user, I can decide what to install. And so I think that's where the work that we're doing to make JavaScript so small is really great, because it's a small step. If a device vendor builds their entire product's app with a script, right, a scripting engine, it's a small step from there for them to say, hey, maybe I should open this up for my customers to be able to script this as well. And that will open new markets for them because it will add new uses to their product.
So you could provide the JavaScript foundation for an API, which could then give the users access to their innards.
Exactly, exactly. And you know, this is a really easy thing for people to understand. You know, if this then that is a wonderful service, kind of a closed service, unfortunately, but a wonderful service where people can write simple logic to control their devices. But it's a little bit silly that the rule that says if my front door opens, turn on the lights, has to go to a cloud server somewhere to execute, right? Like, why does the cloud server need to know my front door opened, right? And why am I limited to the light fixtures, the IoT lights that if this then that decided to support through their business model, right? It's my home, it's my devices, and with a little bit of script that any high school student can learn how to write, I could do that myself. And so there's a lot of power for the device vendors here and a lot of control for the consumers, but we've got to come up from assuming everybody's going to be a Linux programmer. You know, everybody can't operate at that level, and scripts let us do that.
And just as a little plug for you and for us, I understand you're going to talk at the Open Source Convention about this in July.
Yeah, I'm coming up to OSCON. It'll be my second time there. Really looking forward to it, and I think I'm going to be talking some more about this, and specifically, you know, just about how the open source community has been incredibly successful in getting our code into these devices, right? There's hardly a device out there that isn't running a bunch of open source software. But the devices themselves aren't open. And what kind of things can we do to encourage that? Not necessarily force it, it doesn't have to be done by a license, but creating things like scriptable devices where consumers are going to say, yeah, I want that. And manufacturers are going to say, okay, you want it, I'm going to deliver it.
Thank you.
Excellent.